Welcome to the 8th lecture in the 2011-2012 English lecture series. Today we have a very special guest. It is the Consul General, John Ries, from the U.S. Consulate in Sapporo. And he will be talking today about the U.S. role in the global economy. Okay? As I said, it's a great honor to have him here today. He has been all over the world. He has worked in Sierra Leone. He has worked in Rome. Worked for the State Department in Washington, D.C., and he is the U.S. Consul General now in Sapporo. It's a very busy time for the Consul General, and we are very fortunate to have him here. Let us welcome the Consul General of the U.S. Consulate in Sapporo, Mr. John Ries.
They gave me a microphone, and so let me make sure it's turned on. Can you hear me? Yes. All right. First off, Dr. Planky, Professor Planky, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you to you and to the administration for giving me a chance to speak with you today. I arrived in Hokkaido, I arrived in Sapporo last August, and I've been traveling around a lot, both in Hokkaido and Tohoku, which is also part of my district in Japan. But particularly in Hokkaido, I keep running into people in important jobs who are graduates of this university, whether it's in business, whether it's in prefectural government, city government, the media. I think the Otaru University of Commerce has a great network and seems to play a great role in providing human resources to this region. So it's an honor to be able to speak with you today. Let me also, before I start, just express that particularly since the disaster on March 11th, the United States has strongly expressed its sympathies with the people of Japan and the people of Tohoku in particular. Hokkaido also was hit by this event. If you were here, you felt the tremors, I know. I've been out to the Pacific coast of Hokkaido and talked to people who lost property. I know at least one life was lost in Hakodate. But it's for all the people of northern Japan, it was a huge tragedy. At the same time, it was a huge opportunity, in a certain sense, to remind ourselves of the strong ties that we have, because I was delighted to see the response from the United States, from college campuses, from sister cities, all over the U.S. And I think what drove that response was seeing how the people affected by this disaster responded to it, how communities pulled together, how people responded with, how the Japanese people responded with great resolve, and I think demonstrated a strong power to get over, to recover, to come back. And so from a United States government perspective, I just want to sort of reiterate that the United States stands with Japan, our ally, and we want to do everything we can to support the recovery process. That's the end of my official message, so let me get on with the lecture, which is about the U.S. role in the global economy. I've been working as a U.S. diplomat for about 20 years. In places all around the world, but a lot of that work has been in economic matters, in managing our economic relationships with other countries, and working with other countries to try to manage the institutional framework for the global economy. So what I'd like to present for you today is a little bit of historical background about how the United States came to play the role that it plays in the global economy, and how we've worked to try to shape the institutions and the frameworks that define how that economy works. And then also just to try to touch on what's going on with the United States economy, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, some of the challenges that it's confronting in recent years, and most particularly with the financial crisis that occurred 2 years ago, and the aftermath of that. And then I'll be open for your questions. So I hope what I tell you will provoke some thinking, and that you can come back to me with some tough questions, and that we can have a good discussion at the end of this. The United States has had historical advantages that I think have helped it to become a leader in the global economy. It's a large country, it's rich in natural resources, it's got all kinds of landscape, all kinds of mineral resources, wide, far-flung agricultural lands, rivers, transport, rivers that provide transport infrastructure historically. And from its birth as a country, it kept itself at some distance from Europe. It started, obviously, the United States as we know it today came out of European colonies in North America, but from independence, the United States was fairly successful in staying out of the wars and the political strife that characterized Europe's development in the 18th and 19th centuries. But the connection that it did have with Europe was strongest with Great Britain. And as it happened, Great Britain is where the Industrial Revolution really first took off, with the innovations in steam power and development of primitive factories. So having a strong connection with England, having a strong connection with Britain, made it that much easier for the United States to very quickly adopt the innovations that came out of the Industrial Revolution and very quickly put those to use. So even as Great Britain was building trains and building locomotives like the one that was built here in Otaru when Hokkaido was first developed, the United States was not very far behind. By the 1840s, they were beginning to build railroads. By the late 19th century, after the Civil War, a U.S. Industrial Revolution really took off. If you take a look at the same period of time, how was the world economy working? What was the framework for the world economy? It was based largely at that stage on growing European imperialism, and a system in which European countries established colonies. They used military power to bring territories under their control in other parts of the world, to secure natural resources, to secure labor, and they built a system of trade known as mercantilism. Mercantilism refers to a practice in which an imperial power obviously trades with its colonies, but uses its colonies only as a source of raw materials. And what it does with those raw materials, the industries that those materials might feed into, the economic development that comes from that, the imperial powers would only allow to happen in their own country. So in the case of Britain, building factories for textiles in northern England, but with colonies in places like New Zealand where they don't allow factories to be built, they use them as sources of wool for the raw materials going into those factories. It's a very tightly controlled system. There are strict limitations on what colonies could do. If you look at the Caribbean, again, a link to Britain, but there, you had people growing sugar on plantations, but not allowed to do anything with that sugar, basically having to ship it back to industrialists in the mother country. The end result of that is that European living standards rose very quickly, but living standards in the colonies, in the rest of the world, basically did not gain the same benefits from the Industrial Revolution. Because it's a system based on military power and gaining control of territory, that brought along with it problems. That brought along with it issues of competition, and it led to military competition in the late 19th century, most pronounced between England and Germany for control of the seas, for naval power, and then on the European continent among a number of players, but maybe most pronounced between Germany and France. And that competition inevitably set the stage for the outbreak of a very large conflict, the First World War. The First World War was devastating for Europe, and it was devastating for many of the countries that were colonial possessions of the European powers. But America didn't really get involved in it until its very end, the last year or so of that war. And so by the time the war concluded and people began to look to negotiate a peace and to think about what the world should look like after that war, the United States was in a strong position. It was not as exhausted as the European powers were. And it had a president, Woodrow Wilson, who had what some would consider a rather idealistic vision of trying to change the character of how countries deal with each other and how the international system is set up. So he brought to the Versailles Peace Treaty negotiations a concept for international relations based not on the exercise of individual countries' power, but on a multilateral diplomacy, a concept of multilateral diplomacy where countries gather together and agree and try to build a consensus in handling the matters that come up in the international world. And his proposal was to form what became the League of Nations. The Versailles Peace Treaty, the Versailles Conference was an interesting conference. You consider in those days when it took months for people to get across, it might take weeks to get across the Atlantic Ocean. To have the President of the United States spend, I think, months at a time in Europe working on these negotiations, it was sort of unprecedented. And Wilson was very persistent, but he was arguing with leaders of Britain and France who really didn't want to let go of what they had before the war, didn't really want to let go of their empires. They needed the United States' support and cooperation to come up with an agreement. And so in the final analysis, they went along with the concept of a League of Nations, but they did so grudgingly. And for them, it was the price for, they agreed to accept the idea of a League of Nations. In exchange for that, they insisted on exacting very harsh terms on Germany and the other powers that lost the war.